The screams that shattered the peaceful Virginia morning on Sunday, September 11th, 1853, weren't coming from the slave quarters, where suffering was routine and expected. They were coming from inside Riverside Chapel, where Reverend Joshua Sterling lay face down and motionless in the baptismal font, his body held underwater by the strong hands of Louisa Washington, a 42-year-old enslaved woman who had spent 3 years planning the perfect moment to drown the man who called himself God's servant while systematically raping enslaved women and selling their children to finance his comfortable lifestyle. As one of Virginia's most respected Methodist ministers, the sight of a black woman holding a white preacher underwater in the very font where he performed baptisms created a scene so blasphemous and shocking that the white congregation members who discovered them couldn't initially comprehend what they were witnessing, their beloved minister being murdered in his own church by an enslaved woman whose rage had finally overcome 3 decades of patient endurance and Christian submission that had protected Ed Sterling while he committed crimes that earthly law would never punish. If you're ready to discover the most shocking murder in Virginia church history, where an enslaved woman used sacred baptismal water to deliver justice that neither law nor God seemed willing to provide, transforming a house of worship into a site of execution for a preacher whose piety was a mask for systematic sexual violence and child trafficking, hit that subscribe button right now, give this video a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what Louisa accomplished in that chapel font will challenge everything you thought you knew about religion, justice, and the terrible choices that slavery forced upon people who had exhausted every other option for stopping crimes that their society refused to acknowledge or punish. The revenge that would shock Virginia and become one of the most discussed church murders in American history had been building for nearly 3 decades at Magnolia Grove Plantation, where Louisa had been enslaved since birth and where Reverend Sterling had served as both the plantation's Methodist minister and its unofficial chaplain, conducting Sunday services for enslaved people while privately exploiting his position of religious authority to abuse women who had been taught that submission to white men, especially ministers, was their Christian duty. The drowning in the baptismal font represented the culmination of 30 years of accumulated rage, 15 different sexual assaults that Sterling had committed against Louisa herself, and the final unbearable trauma of watching him sell her 17-year-old daughter Ruth to a brothel in Richmond after the girl had become pregnant with his child. The year was 1853, and Virginia's Tidewater region had developed elaborate religious structures designed to provide spiritual comfort to enslaved people, while reinforcing their submission to earthly masters who claimed divine authority for their ownership of human beings. Methodist and Baptist churches throughout the region conducted special services for enslaved populations, with white ministers preaching sermons about Christian duty that emphasized obedience, patience, and acceptance of suffering as paths to heavenly reward that would compensate for earthly bondage. These religious services served multiple functions. They provided psychological relief for enslaved people while channeling their spiritual needs in directions that supported rather than challenged the institution that held them in bondage. Riverside Chapel sat on a hill overlooking the Rappahannock River, a modest white wooden structure with a tall spire that could be seen from miles away across Virginia's rolling countryside. The chapel had been built in 1820 by Colonel William Thornfield, owner of Magnolia Grove Plantation, as part of his commitment to providing Christian instruction for the 300 enslaved people whose labor produced his tobacco wealth. The chapel featured separate entrances and seating areas for white and black congregants, with enslaved people occupying a gallery above the main floor, where they could hear sermons but couldn't mix with white worshippers who sat in cushioned pews below. The baptismal font, a large marble basin that would become the scene of Sterling's murder, sat prominently at the front of the chapel, symbolizing the Christian rebirth that enslaved people were encouraged to seek through spiritual rather than physical liberation. Reverend Joshua Sterling, 56 years old in 1853, represented the worst hypocrisies of Southern Christianity as practiced by men who used religious authority to exploit people they claimed to serve spiritually. Sterling had been ministering at Riverside Chapel for 12 years, having arrived in 1841 with credentials from Methodist institutions and recommendations that emphasized his dedication to bringing Christian salvation to enslaved populations. His sermons were renowned throughout Tidewater, Virginia, for their eloquence and their ability to move both white and black listeners to tears, with Sterling's reputation as a powerful preacher, making him one of the region's most respected religious figures. But Sterling's public piety masked systematic sexual predation that he conducted under cover of religious authority, exploiting his position to abuse enslaved women who had been taught that resistance to white ministers was resistance to God himself. His methodology involved using private religious counseling sessions to isolate vulnerable women, claiming that their spiritual development required special attention that only he could provide, then using combinations of religious manipulation and implicit threats about their family's safety to coerce sexual compliance from women who understood that resistance would bring punishment not just upon themselves, but upon their children and loved ones. Louisa Washington had been born at Magnolia Grove in 1811, the daughter of enslaved parents who had died when she was young and who had been raised by the plantation's religious community that emphasized Christian virtues of patience, forgiveness, and submission as survival strategies in a world where open resistance meant death. Louisa had been an exceptionally devout child and young woman, finding in Methodist Christianity a source of strength and community that helped her endure the brutal realities of plantation life, and had become one of Riverside Chapel's most dedicated congregants who attended every service and who had served as an unofficial leader among the enslaved women who gathered for prayer meetings and spiritual support. The relationship between Louisa and Sterling, that would eventually lead to murder in the chapel, had begun in 1823, when Louisa was 12 years old, and Sterling had identified her as someone who needed special religious instruction due to her influence among other enslaved people. The instruction had quickly become sexual abuse that Sterling justified through distorted religious interpretations, claiming that enslaved women's submission to white ministers was a form of Christian duty that demonstrated their spiritual development and their acceptance of divine hierarchy that placed white men above black women in all matters, including physical relationships. The pattern of abuse that Sterling inflicted upon Louisa over 30 years had included not just sexual assault, but also psychological manipulation that used her deep Christian faith against her, as Sterling convinced her that their encounters were spiritually meaningful rather than criminal violence, that God had chosen her for special service that required submission to his representative on earth, and that resistance or disclosure would demonstrate sinful pride and disobedience that would result in divine punishment against her and her family. The religious framework that Sterling used to justify and conceal his crimes was particularly devastating because it corrupted the very spiritual beliefs that Louisa depended on for psychological survival in slavery. The children that resulted from Sterling's repeated rapes of Louisa, including Ruth, born in 1836, grew up in the impossible situation of being enslaved people whose white father was a respected minister who acknowledged them neither legally nor personally, but who exercised control over their lives through his influence with Colonel Thornfield and his authority within the plantation's religious community. Sterling had arranged for these children to receive slightly better treatment than typical field hands, assignment to household duties rather than backbreaking agricultural labor. But this privilege came with the understood price that their mother would continue to be available for his sexual exploitation, and that the children themselves would never challenge or expose their parentage. The specific incident that finally pushed Louisa from long-suffering victim to murderer had occurred in July 1853, when Sterling had arranged for 17-year-old Ruth to be sold to a Richmond brothel owner who specialized in young women of mixed race and who paid premium prices for enslaved women who could serve wealthy white clients seeking exotic sexual experiences. The sale had been justified through claims that Ruth had become unmanageable and needed to be removed from Magnolia Grove's influence. But everyone understood that the real motive was removing evidence of Sterling's paternity while profiting from the sale of his own daughter into sexual slavery that would likely kill her within a few years. The psychological devastation that Louisa experienced upon learning that her daughter, Sterling's own child, had been sold to a brothel represented the final breaking point that transformed 30 years of endurance into determination for revenge that would be both public and devastating. The sale violated every pretense of Christian morality that Sterling claimed to represent, demonstrated that no amount of submission or patience would protect Louisa's children from his exploitation, and made clear that the only way to prevent further crimes was to kill the man committing them regardless of his religious position or social standing. The planning of Sterling's murder during the 2 months between Ruth's sale and the September drowning had involved Louisa working through various scenarios and selecting one that would maximize both symbolic impact and practical effectiveness while exploiting Sterling's routines and vulnerabilities. The chapel setting was chosen because it would demonstrate that Sterling's crimes had corrupted sacred space, because it would force white Virginia to confront the contradiction between Christian ideals and slavery's realities, and because it would occur in the one location where Sterling felt completely safe and where he would never expect to face violence from someone he had trained to view him as God's representative. The baptismal font itself became the murder weapon because it represented the spiritual rebirth that Christianity promised, but which slavery made impossible, because it would create symbolic parallels between Sterling's death and the baptisms he had performed, and because drowning in holy water would send a message about divine justice that earthly justice had failed to provide. Louisa had studied the font's dimensions and water depth, had observed Sterling's habits during chapel preparation, and had identified Sunday morning before services as the optimal time when Sterling would be alone in the chapel, making final preparations while congregation members were still arriving. The religious justification that Louisa had developed for murdering a minister involved concluding that Sterling was not actually God's representative, but rather an agent of evil who used religious authority to commit crimes that genuine Christians would never tolerate, and that killing him was therefore not murder of a holy man, but rather destruction of a false prophet who had corrupted God's church and God's people. The framework was theologically sophisticated and reflected Louisa's decades of serious religious study, but it also demonstrated the moral impossibilities that slavery created, where the only path to justice sometimes required violating the very Christian principles that victims had been taught to embrace. The morning of September 11, 1853, had dawned clear and warm as Louisa walked from the slave quarters to Riverside Chapel, carrying the wooden bucket she used to help prepare communion elements, her external appearance giving no indication that she was minutes away from committing one of the most shocking murders in Virginia history. Sterling was alone in the chapel as expected, kneeling beside the baptismal font in prayer or meditation, his back to the door as Louisa entered, and approached him with the steady stride of someone who had spent 2 months preparing for this moment, and who felt no doubt about the righteousness of what she was about to do. The confrontation that occurred in the moments before Sterling's death would be reconstructed later through Louisa's confession and the physical evidence left in the chapel, revealing that she had given Sterling opportunity to repent and to acknowledge his crimes before delivering the justice that neither law nor church hierarchy had been willing to provide. The last words that Sterling spoke were apparently a question about why Louisa was looking at him that way, suggesting that he finally recognized the rage that 30 years of abuse had created, but had never expected to face consequences for his systematic exploitation of women who had been taught that submission was their Christian duty. The religious education that would both sustain Louisa through 30 years of abuse and ultimately provide the moral framework for murdering her abuser had begun in her childhood at Magnolia Grove, where Methodist Christianity was taught to enslaved people as a system of beliefs emphasizing patience, submission, and the promise that earthly suffering would be rewarded with heavenly salvation that compensated for bondage's brutality. Louisa had embraced these teachings with extraordinary devotion from her earliest years, finding in Methodist hymns and prayers a source of spiritual strength that helped her endure the loss of her parents, the backbreaking labor of tobacco cultivation, and the daily indignities of being treated as property rather than as a human being created in God's image. But the Christianity that Louisa learned from enslaved elders was subtly different from the version that white ministers preached. It emphasized liberation themes from Exodus alongside submission messages, contained traditions of resistance disguised as spiritual metaphors, and included understanding that God's justice sometimes required human agents to deliver it when earthly systems failed. The foundation of Louisa's theological development had been built through the underground religious education that occurred in slave quarters away from white supervision, where elderly enslaved people who remembered African spiritual traditions blended them with Christian teachings to create a faith that sustained rather than suppressed resistance. These elders had taught that the God who freed Israel from Egyptian bondage cared about enslaved people's liberation, that biblical injunctions about submission applied only when authorities acted righteously rather than wickedly, and that sometimes God called his people to take drastic action against evil that threatened to destroy entire communities. These teachings existed alongside and sometimes in tension with the official Methodist doctrine that white ministers like Sterling preached, creating religious frameworks that could justify either patient endurance or violent resistance depending on circumstances. The transformation of Louisa from devout child into young woman who captured Sterling's predatory attention had occurred gradually during her adolescence as she developed into someone whose combination of physical attractiveness and spiritual dedication made her both vulnerable to exploitation and valuable as a target whose corruption would demonstrate Sterling's power over even the most faithful among his enslaved congregation. Sterling's initial approaches in 1823, when Louisa was 12, had been framed entirely in religious terms. He claimed to recognize special spiritual gifts in her that required private instruction, described their time together as preparation for leadership roles within the enslaved religious community, and used biblical passages selectively interpreted to suggest that physical submission to God's representatives was itself a form of worship. The sexual abuse that began during these private religious instruction sessions represented a profound corruption of the faith that sustained Louisa's psychological survival in slavery, as Sterling systematically used Christian theology to justify and conceal crimes that any honest reading of Scripture would condemn. The abuse sessions themselves were framed as spiritual experiences where Louisa's submission demonstrated her faith, where Sterling's exploitation was recast as divine blessing, and where any resistance or disclosure was characterized as sin that would result in punishment from God himself. The psychological manipulation was extraordinarily sophisticated and effective, keeping Louisa compliant for years through religious frameworks that made resistance seem like spiritual failure rather than righteous self-defense. But even as Sterling exploited Louisa's faith to facilitate his abuse, that same faith provided resources for resistance that would eventually manifest as murder when all other options had been exhausted. The enslaved elders who had taught Louisa about God's concern for the oppressed also taught her to recognize false prophets who used religious authority for evil purposes, to understand that submission had limits when authorities demanded sin rather than righteousness, and to believe that God sometimes called ordinary people to deliver extraordinary justice when established systems failed. These counter-teachings existed beneath Louisa's outward compliance, creating psychological resources that would eventually allow her to reframe Sterling's murder, not as crime but as righteous execution of divine judgment against someone who had corrupted God's church. The pattern of abuse that Sterling inflicted on Louisa over 30 years had included at least 15 documented sexual assaults, the number Louisa could specifically remember and date, though the actual total was likely higher given that some incidents during early years had blurred together in her traumatized memory. Each assault followed similar patterns. Sterling would summon Louisa for supposedly spiritual purposes, would use religious language and biblical references to create atmosphere that framed what was about to happen as sacred rather than criminal, would rape her while speaking about divine will and spiritual development, and would conclude with prayers thanking God for their communion, and with warnings about the spiritual consequences of disclosure that would bring God's wrath upon Louisa and her family. The children that resulted from these repeated rapes, Ruth, born in 1836, Samuel in 1839, and Mary in 1842, grew up in the shadow of Sterling's hypocrisy, acknowledged neither by their father nor by the white community that praised Sterling's Christian devotion, while ignoring or refusing to recognize the mixed-race children, whose features clearly indicated white paternity. Sterling had arranged for these children to work in Magnolia Grove's main house rather than in tobacco fields, a privilege that seemed generous, but which actually served his interests by keeping his illegitimate offspring under closer supervision, and by creating dependency that made disclosure of their parentage less likely. The psychological complexity of Louisa's relationship with her children by rape involved loving them absolutely, while being constantly reminded through their existence of the violence that had created them, wanting to protect them from Sterling's continued influence, while understanding that any direct challenge to his authority would result in them being sold away as punishment. The impossible position of enslaved mothers whose children were fathered by their rapists represented one of slavery's cruelest dimensions, creating situations where maternal love and protective instinct had to coexist with powerlessness to prevent children's exploitation by the same men who had violated their mothers. The specific incidents during the 30 years of abuse that had pushed Louisa closest to resistance before the final breaking point had included a rape that occurred in 1848, immediately after Louisa had participated in communion service, with Sterling justifying the timing by claiming that her spiritual state following communion made their union particularly blessed. The sacrilege of being raped minutes after taking communion, the central sacrament of Christian worship, had been almost unbearable, creating a crisis of faith where Louisa had to choose between abandoning Christianity entirely or developing more sophisticated theology that could distinguish between true faith and its corruption. By men like Sterling, the resolution of this crisis had involved Louisa developing a framework that separated genuine Christianity from its perversion by white slaveholders who claimed divine authority for systematic evil. She began understanding Sterling not as God's representative but as a false prophet whose religious position made his crimes more rather than less condemnable, and began seeing resistance to his authority not as sin but as faithfulness to the genuine God who had been misrepresented by corrupt ministers. This theological development was crucial because it provided the moral foundation that would eventually allow Louisa to murder Sterling without experiencing crippling guilt or feeling that she had betrayed her Christian faith. The community support that Louisa received from other enslaved women who had experienced Sterling's abuse or who knew about it through Magnolia Grove's intelligence networks provided both practical assistance and moral validation during the decades of suffering. These women had developed their own theological frameworks for understanding Sterling's crimes, had created support systems that helped victims survive psychologically, and had maintained careful documentation of Sterling's pattern of abuse, even though they had no legal mechanisms for using this evidence to stop him. The collective knowledge among enslaved women about Sterling's systematic predation meant that Louisa's eventual decision to kill him was understood and supported by people who recognized that 30 years of patience had been exhausted and that violence was the only remaining option. The year 1853 had begun with signs that Sterling's abuse was expanding to target Louisa's daughter Ruth, who at 17 had developed into a young woman whose physical attractiveness and spiritual dedication, inherited from her mother, had caught Sterling's attention in ways that suggested he intended to establish with the daughter the same exploitative relationship he had maintained with the mother. The first indication had come in February, when Sterling had begun requiring Ruth to attend private religious instruction sessions similar to those that had preceded his abuse of Louisa 30 years earlier, using the same justifications about special spiritual gifts requiring personalized guidance. Louisa's attempts to protect Ruth from repeating her own experiences had been limited by the realities of enslavement and Sterling's authority within Magnolia Grove's social structure, as any direct accusation against him would have been dismissed as lies from enslaved people trying to defame a respected minister, and any attempt to prevent Ruth from attending the instruction sessions would have been punished as interference with Christian education. The powerlessness that Louisa experienced watching Sterling begin grooming her daughter exactly as he had groomed her 3 decades earlier represented a trauma that compounded all the previous abuse, creating a situation where the only way to protect Ruth seemed to be removing Sterling permanently through murder. The pregnancy that Ruth disclosed to her mother in May 1853, clearly resulting from Sterling's rape during the private instruction sessions, had created both confirmation that the abuse cycle was repeating and a crisis that would culminate in Ruth's sale to a Richmond brothel. Sterling's response to learning of Ruth's pregnancy had been to arrange her sale immediately, claiming that she had become morally corrupted and needed to be removed from Magnolia Grove's Christian community, when actually he was removing evidence of his paternity and his statutory rape of a girl he had been assigned to instruct spiritually. The sale itself in July 1853 had been conducted with the participation of Colonel Thornfield, who either believed Sterling's characterization of Ruth as corrupted or who understood the truth but valued his relationship with the respected minister more than he valued the well-being of an enslaved girl. Ruth had been transported to Richmond in chains, sold to a brothel owner for $1.200, a premium price reflecting her youth and mixed-race status, and disappeared into the city's commercial sex industry, where life expectancy was measured in years and where the religious education Sterling had provided would be useless for survival in a world built on systematic sexual exploitation. The 2 months between Ruth's sale and Sterling's murder had been marked by Louisa's transformation from victim who had endured 3 decades of abuse into someone capable of killing a man she had been taught to view as God's representative. The transformation involved working through both practical and theological challenges. Practically, how to kill Sterling in a way that would succeed despite her lack of physical advantages. Theologically, how to justify murder of a minister in a way that wouldn't destroy her Christian faith or make her feel that she had committed unforgivable sin. The practical planning had involved studying Sterling's routines and identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with limited physical strength, but with complete access to the chapel and knowledge of Sterling's habits. The drowning method was chosen because water required less physical force than other methods, because the baptismal font provided symbolic resonance, and because Sterling's position of kneeling beside the font during his Sunday morning preparations created perfect opportunity for surprise attack that would allow Louisa to push his head under water before he could effectively resist. The theological justification had involved Louisa developing a sophisticated argument that Sterling's crimes had voided his ministerial authority, that false prophets who led people astray deserved death according to biblical precedent, and that God sometimes called ordinary people to execute judgment when earthly systems failed to provide justice. The framework drew on Old Testament passages about destroying false prophets, New Testament warnings about wolves in sheep's clothing, and the liberation theology that enslaved communities had developed through centuries of interpreting Scripture through their own experiences of oppression. If this story of 30 years of religious abuse culminating in holy water transformed into murder weapon has you completely gripped and desperate to know exactly what happened in that chapel when Louisa finally decided that patient submission had failed and that only violence could stop a predator protected by religious authority, make sure you hit that like button right now to support these extraordinary tales of resistance delivered through means that challenge our assumptions about religion, morality, and justice. Subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss these deep dives into the most shocking true stories where faith became both the tool of oppression and the foundation for violent liberation. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what you think about using violence against religious authorities who abuse their positions. I read every comment and love hearing your perspectives on these impossible moral situations. The stage was set for Sunday morning, September 11th, 1853, when Louisa would walk into Riverside Chapel carrying 30 years of accumulated rage disguised as morning devotion, when the baptismal font would transform from symbol of spiritual rebirth into instrument of righteous execution, and when Virginia's comfortable assumptions about Christian slavery would be shattered by an enslaved woman who proved that some forms of justice require drowning false prophets in the holy water they had corrupted through their crimes. The execution of Reverend Joshua Sterling began at precisely 8:15 on Sunday morning, September 11th, 1853, when Louisa Washington entered Riverside Chapel through the side door reserved for enslaved people, preparing communion elements, and found her rapist exactly where she had predicted he would be, kneeling beside the baptismal font in prayer or meditation, his back to the entrance, his body positioned perfectly for someone approaching from behind to push his head underwater before he could mount effective resistance. The marble font contained approximately 18 inches of water that Sterling had drawn earlier that morning in preparation for a baptism scheduled for later in the service, water that was supposed to symbolize spiritual cleansing and rebirth, but which would instead become the instrument through which Louisa delivered justice that 30 years of prayer had failed to provide, and which Virginia's legal system would never deliver against a respected white minister who had systematically raped enslaved women under cover of religious authority. The approach that Louisa made across the chapel's wooden floor toward Sterling represented the culmination of 2 months of planning and 30 years of accumulated rage as she walked steadily toward the man who had stolen her childhood, violated her body repeatedly, corrupted her faith, and sold her daughter into sexual slavery to conceal his crimes. Louisa carried no weapon because she needed none. The water in the baptismal font would serve that purpose, and her element of surprise, combined with Sterling's vulnerable position, would provide the seconds she needed to get his head underwater and to hold it there long enough to ensure he drowned regardless of how violently he struggled, once he understood what was happening. The sound of Louisa's footsteps on the wooden floor finally alerted Sterling to her presence when she was approximately 10 feet away, causing him to turn his head and begin to rise from his kneeling position beside the font. The expression on his face as he recognized Louisa revealed no concern or alarm. Enslaved people entering the chapel to help with preparations was routine, and Louisa in particular had assisted with communion arrangements for years, making her presence seem completely normal and unthreatening to a man who had never imagined that someone he had trained to submit through religious manipulation might eventually decide that submission had limits and that some crimes justified violence regardless of Christian teachings about turning the other cheek. "Louisa," Sterling had said with mild surprise, checking his pocket watch and noting that she was earlier than usual for Sunday preparations. "You're here quite early this morning. The communion elements aren't ready yet for—" His words were cut off as Louisa closed the final distance between them with sudden speed, her hands finding his shoulders and shoving him forward with strength born of 30 years of suppressed rage finally finding release. Sterling's body pitched forward over the edge of the baptismal font, his face plunging into the water with a splash that echoed through the empty chapel, his hands instinctively reaching out to brace himself against the marble sides of the font, to push himself back up and away from the water that was suddenly filling his nose and mouth. But Louisa's hands were already on the back of his head, pressing down with all her weight and strength, forcing Sterling's face deeper into the water and preventing him from raising his head far enough to breathe. The physical struggle that followed represented the inversion of every power dynamic that had defined their relationship for 3 decades. Sterling had always controlled their encounters through his authority, his gender, his race, and his religious position. But now Louisa held absolute power over whether he lived or died, and she had already decided that 30 years of patient Christianity had failed to stop his crimes, and that only his death would prevent him from destroying other women and girls the way he had destroyed her and Ruth. The sounds that Sterling made as he struggled against drowning were muffled by the water covering his face, but were nonetheless audible as desperate gurgles and gasps that indicated he understood he was dying and that no amount of struggle was succeeding in getting his head above water long enough to breathe effectively. His hands clawed at the sides of the baptismal font, seeking purchase that would allow him to push himself up. His legs kicked violently behind him, creating splashing that sprayed water across the chapel floor. His entire body convulsed with the kind of primal panic that drowning produces as the brain recognizes oxygen deprivation and floods the system with adrenaline in desperate final attempts at survival. But Louisa maintained her grip on Sterling's head with a determination that 30 years of abuse had forged into something unbreakable, her hands pressing down relentlessly as she watched the man who had raped her 15 times, who had sold her daughter to a brothel, who had corrupted God's church with his systematic predation, slowly drown in the holy water he had drawn that morning to perform baptisms. The physical exertion was intense. Holding a struggling adult man's head underwater required strength and endurance that tested Louisa's capabilities, but she had prepared for this, had rehearsed mentally the exact amount of time and pressure needed, and had committed herself absolutely to seeing the execution through to completion, regardless of how violently Sterling fought against his death. The moment when Sterling's struggles began to weaken and then cease marked the transition from active drowning to the final stages where brain death would occur within minutes, once oxygen deprivation became absolute. His hands, which had been clawing desperately at the baptismal font's marble sides, gradually relaxed and slipped down into the water. His legs, which had been kicking violently, went still. His entire body, which had been convulsing with struggle, became limp and unresisting as consciousness faded and then vanished completely. Louisa maintained her grip for several minutes after Sterling's movements ceased, understanding that drowning victims could sometimes revive if removed from water too quickly, and wanting to ensure absolutely that the man who had tormented her for 30 years was genuinely dead, rather than merely unconscious. The scene that Louisa observed as she finally released Sterling's head and stepped back from the baptismal font represented both perfect execution of her plan and complete destruction of the respectable Christian life she had maintained alongside her suffering. Sterling's body floated face down in the baptismal water, his arms spread wide in a position that resembled crucifixion, his expensive ministerial robes soaked and heavy with the water that had killed him. The peaceful setting of the chapel with its wooden pews, its hymnals neatly arranged, its cross prominently displayed above the pulpit, stood in terrible contrast to the violence that had just occurred, and to the corpse that now desecrated the baptismal font, where hundreds of enslaved people had been baptized under Sterling's ministry. The psychological state that Louisa experienced in the minutes immediately after killing Sterling involved not the guilt or horror that she had anticipated might follow murder, but rather a profound sense of relief and vindication that justice had finally been delivered against someone who had evaded earthly punishment for 3 decades. She felt no remorse for taking Sterling's life, no fear about the consequences she would face, no doubt that what she had done was righteous execution rather than criminal murder. The certainty was almost transcendent in its intensity. Louisa had killed a false prophet who had corrupted God's church, and she believed absolutely that she had acted according to divine will, even though earthly law would judge her actions as murder deserving of death. The discovery of Sterling's body occurred approximately 15 minutes after Louisa had drowned him, when the first white congregation members arrived for Sunday service and entered the chapel to find their minister floating dead in the baptismal font, while Louisa sat calmly in one of the pews reserved for enslaved people, her hands folded in her lap, her expression serene, showing no signs of the violence she had just committed, except for the water that had splashed onto her dress during Sterling's struggles. The screams that erupted when the congregation members recognized what they were seeing, their beloved minister murdered in his own church, created chaos that brought more people running from the area around the chapel where they had been gathering before services. The immediate assumption among white congregation members was that Louisa must be insane or possessed by demons to have committed such a blasphemous act, as they couldn't conceive of rational motivation for an enslaved woman to murder a respected minister in his own church. The attempts to understand what had happened involved multiple people shouting questions at Louisa simultaneously, demanding to know why she had killed Reverend Sterling, what madness had possessed her, whether she understood the enormity of what she had done. But Louisa remained calm and silent through this initial chaos, waiting for the moment when she could deliver her full testimony about 30 years of systematic abuse in a way that would force Virginia's white Christian community to confront truths they had been avoiding or refusing to acknowledge. The arrival of Colonel Thornfield and the sheriff approximately 30 minutes after the discovery transformed the scene from chaotic horror into the beginning of legal proceedings that would lead inevitably to Louisa's execution, but which would first require her to explain her actions in ways that would create one of the most significant public scandals in Virginia's religious history. The sheriff's initial questioning attempted to establish basic facts about the murder. Had Louisa killed Sterling? Had she acted alone? Had there been any accomplices or conspirators who needed to be arrested? Louisa's responses were direct and unflinching. Yes, she had drowned Sterling in the baptismal font. Yes, she had acted alone without assistance from anyone else. And yes, she was prepared to explain exactly why she had committed this murder and why she considered it justified, despite knowing that Virginia law would execute her for killing a white man. The confession that Louisa delivered over the following hours, first to the sheriff and Colonel Thornfield in the chapel, then repeated formally at the county courthouse before magistrates and assembled white citizens, represented one of the most detailed and devastating testimonies about clergy sexual abuse ever recorded in antebellum Virginia. Louisa described the 30 years of systematic rape that Sterling had inflicted upon her, beginning when she was 12 years old, the religious manipulation he had used to justify and conceal his crimes, the children who had resulted from these rapes, including Ruth, who Sterling had sold to a Richmond brothel after she became pregnant with his child, and the complete failure of every earthly system to provide justice or protection against a white minister whose crimes everyone had known about or suspected, but which no one had been willing to acknowledge or punish. The impact of Louisa's testimony on those who heard it ranged from shocked denial to reluctant acknowledgement that they had known or suspected Sterling's crimes but had failed to act, as 30 years of accumulated evidence that had been suppressed or ignored suddenly became impossible to dismiss when spoken aloud by someone who had nothing left to lose. Some white listeners attempted to discredit Louisa's account by claiming that enslaved people were prone to lying about white men, but these attempts collapsed when other enslaved women came forward to provide corroborating testimony about their own experiences of Sterling's abuse, and when physical evidence, including Sterling's illegitimate children, whose features clearly indicated white paternity, made denial untenable. The theological dimensions of Louisa's confession created particular crisis for white Virginia's religious community, as she framed her murder of Sterling not as crime, but as execution of divine judgment against a false prophet who had corrupted God's church. The biblical knowledge that Louisa demonstrated during her testimony shocked white listeners who had assumed that enslaved people's Christianity was simplistic and focused only on submission, as she cited specific passages about false prophets deserving death, about wolves in sheep's clothing who needed to be destroyed to protect the flock, and about God sometimes calling ordinary people to deliver justice when established authorities failed to act righteously. Reverend Sterling was not a man of God, Louisa had stated during her formal confession at the courthouse, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room where both white and black Virginians had gathered to hear her testimony. He was a devil who used God's name to commit crimes against women, who had been taught that submission to ministers was Christian duty. For 30 years I prayed that God would stop him, that earthly law would punish him, that someone with authority would protect us from his violence, but nothing happened. God didn't strike him down, and white men who knew or suspected what he was doing chose to protect their minister rather than enslaved women. So I became the instrument of justice that no one else would be. I drowned him in the baptismal font, because that water symbolizes the spiritual cleansing he corrupted through his crimes, and I have no regret except that I couldn't save my daughter before he sold her to her death. The legal proceedings that followed Louisa's confession moved rapidly toward predetermined conclusion, as Virginia law made the execution of enslaved people who killed white men essentially automatic, regardless of motivation or circumstances. The trial lasted less than a day, with Louisa's confession eliminating any need for evidence gathering or witness examination beyond establishing that Sterling was indeed dead and that Louisa had killed him deliberately rather than accidentally. The defense that her court-appointed lawyer attempted, arguing that 30 years of systematic rape constituted extreme provocation that should mitigate her punishment, was dismissed by the judge as irrelevant since enslaved people had no legal right to resist white authority regardless of abuse they experienced. The verdict was guilty of murder, delivered within hours of the trial's beginning. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out within 2 weeks as Virginia law required for enslaved people convicted of killing whites. But the speed and legal inevitability of these proceedings couldn't erase the impact that Louisa's testimony had created, as her detailed account of Sterling's crimes and the religious frameworks he had used to justify them had exposed contradictions between Virginia's Christian ideals and slavery's realities in ways that no abolitionist sermon or political speech had ever accomplished. The execution of Louisa Washington occurred on September 25, 1853, exactly 2 weeks after she drowned Reverend Joshua Sterling in Riverside Chapel's baptismal font, with thousands of spectators gathering to witness the hanging of an enslaved woman who had murdered a white minister, but whose testimony about 30 years of systematic rape had created the largest religious scandal in Virginia's history and forced the Methodist Church to confront clergy sexual abuse that everyone had known about, but which no one had been willing to acknowledge or punish. The hanging was designed as public spectacle, intended to demonstrate that enslaved resistance against white authority would always be crushed regardless of motivation. But Louisa's final words from the gallows transformed her execution into an indictment of both slavery and the religious institutions that had sanctioned it, as she declared that she died satisfied with having delivered justice that earthly law and Christian churches had failed to provide for 3 decades. The 2 weeks between Louisa's conviction and her execution had been marked by the most intense religious and social crisis that Tidewater, Virginia had experienced since Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. As her detailed testimony about Sterling's crimes and the Methodist Church's failure to stop him, despite widespread knowledge among clergy and congregation leaders, created pressure for investigations that would expose the scope of sexual abuse within Virginia's religious institutions. The Methodist Church hierarchy initially attempted to contain the scandal by claiming that Sterling's crimes were those of an individual bad actor, rather than evidence of systemic problems. But this defense collapsed when multiple other enslaved women came forward with testimony about abuse by different ministers, and when church records revealed that complaints about Sterling had been filed and ignored repeatedly over the 12 years he had served at Riverside Chapel. The investigation that Virginia's Methodist Conference reluctantly authorized in the week following Sterling's death revealed patterns of clergy sexual abuse that extended far beyond the immediate case, documenting systematic exploitation of enslaved women by ministers who used religious authority to coerce compliance while church leaders either actively covered up the crimes or passively enabled them through refusal to investigate or discipline clergy accused of sexual misconduct. The report identified at least 8 other ministers in Virginia who had been credibly accused of sexually abusing enslaved women in their congregations, with evidence suggesting that church leadership had known about or suspected these crimes, but had prioritized protecting ministerial reputations over preventing continued abuse. The theological crisis that Louisa's testimony created for Virginia's white Christian community involved confronting the contradiction between Christian teachings about morality and the reality that slavery enabled systematic sexual violence that churches not only failed to prevent, but actively facilitated through religious frameworks that taught enslaved women that submission to white authority, including sexual submission, was Christian duty. The comfortable assumption that slavery could be Christian institution if masters and overseers adhered to certain standards of conduct was demolished by evidence that even ministers supposedly dedicated to Christian principles used their positions to commit crimes that violated every moral teaching they preached to others. But the scandal also created crisis for enslaved Christians who had relied on Methodist and Baptist churches as sources of spiritual sustenance and community support, as Louisa's testimony forced recognition that religious institutions they had trusted were complicit in the sexual exploitation they or their loved ones had experienced. The resolution of this crisis took various forms across Virginia's enslaved population. Some people abandoned Christianity entirely, viewing it as hopelessly corrupted by white supremacy. Others developed more sophisticated theological frameworks that distinguished between genuine faith and its perversion by slaveholders, and still others intensified their religious devotion while shifting it away from white-controlled churches toward underground religious communities that rejected white ministerial authority entirely. The impact on Sterling's other victims, the enslaved women besides Louisa who had experienced his abuse over 12 years at Riverside Chapel, was complex and often devastating, as public exposure of Sterling's crimes brought both validation that they had told truth about abuse that had been dismissed or ignored, and additional trauma from having their experiences discussed publicly in ways that often blamed victims or minimized Sterling's responsibility. Several of Sterling's victims provided testimony during the Methodist investigation that corroborated Louisa's account and expanded understanding of the scope and sophistication of Sterling's predation, describing religious manipulation techniques that mirrored what Louisa had experienced, and confirming that church leaders had been informed about Sterling's behavior but had taken no action to stop it. The fate of Ruth Washington, Louisa's 17-year-old daughter who Sterling had sold to a Richmond brothel after she became pregnant with his child, became a focal point for abolitionists who used her story to illustrate slavery's systematic destruction of families and the sexual exploitation that pervaded the institution. Efforts to locate and rescue Ruth from Richmond's commercial sex industry proved unsuccessful, with evidence suggesting she had died within months of her sale, likely from disease or violence that was endemic in brothels, serving working-class white men who treated enslaved prostitutes with casual brutality. The knowledge that Ruth had died while Louisa awaited execution created additional tragedy that deepened the symbolic significance of both women's suffering and Louisa's decision to kill the man responsible. The execution itself on September 25th was attended by the largest crowd that had gathered for any public event in Central Virginia since George Washington's death, with estimates suggesting that between 5,000 and 10,000 people, including both whites and enslaved blacks who had been given or taken time away from plantation labor, assembled to witness Louisa's hanging. The execution was designed to occur outside Riverside Chapel as symbolic demonstration that crimes against religious authority would be punished at the sites where they occurred, though this plan was abandoned when Methodist church leaders objected to associating their chapel with an execution even of someone who had murdered their minister there. The gallows was instead erected in the county seat's main square, with Louisa transported from jail in a wagon that passed through streets lined with spectators who shouted various combinations of condemnation for her crime and sympathy for the abuse she had endured. The journey to the execution site took approximately 30 minutes and was marked by Louisa's remarkable composure and dignity as she sat in the wagon with head held high, refusing to show the fear or remorse that white authorities wanted from enslaved criminals being led to execution. The contrast between official expectations that she would be broken and contrite and the actual reality of her calm defiance created additional controversy about whether her execution would serve its intended purpose of deterring other enslaved people from resistance. The final statement that Louisa delivered from the gallows platform before the noose was placed around her neck became one of the most quoted pieces of testimony in antebellum American history, as she used her final minutes of life to deliver a theological and moral indictment of slavery and the religious institutions that had sanctioned it. Standing before thousands of witnesses with the rope that would kill her already visible beside her, Louisa had spoken with voice that carried clearly across the assembled crowd. "I am about to die for killing Reverend Joshua Sterling, and Virginia law says that this is justice for an enslaved woman who murdered a white minister. But God's justice is different from earthly justice, and I believe that what I did was righteous execution of a false prophet who corrupted God's church through 30 years of systematic rape and violence against women who were taught that submission to him was Christian duty. Reverend Sterling raped me 15 times beginning when I was 12 years old. He used the Bible to justify his crimes and his position as minister to conceal them. He sold my daughter, his own child, to a brothel to hide his guilt after he raped her too, and everyone knew or suspected what he was doing, but no one stopped him because white men's authority was more important than enslaved women's suffering. I die today, satisfied that I delivered justice that neither earthly law nor Christian churches would provide. I die believing that God will judge me according to righteousness, rather than according to Virginia's laws that protect rapists when they are white ministers and execute their victims when they fight back. I die hoping that my testimony has exposed the evil that slavery enables and that churches sanction, and that others who have suffered what I suffered will understand that submission has limits, and that some crimes justify violence, regardless of what earthly authorities claim about Christian duty requiring patience. To the enslaved people watching this execution, remember that false prophets deserve death, that religious authority can be corrupted by evil men, and that God sometimes calls ordinary people to deliver justice when those with earthly power refuse to act. To the white people watching, understand that every enslaved woman who serves in your houses, who attends your churches, who raises your children, has experienced or witnessed violence that your comfortable Christianity pretends doesn't exist. And know that what I did to Reverend Sterling, drowning him in the baptismal font he corrupted, was mercy compared to what God will do to everyone who participated in or enabled slavery's crimes against people created in his image. The hanging that followed Louisa's statement was carried out efficiently by authorities who wanted to minimize the time available for her words to have impact on the assembled crowd. But the speed of her execution couldn't erase the effect that her testimony had created. The image of Louisa standing on the gallows, delivering theological and moral condemnation of slavery while awaiting her own death, became symbolic for abolitionists throughout the North, who reproduced her final statement in newspapers and pamphlets that used her case to argue that slavery corrupted everything it touched, including religious institutions that claimed to represent Christian values. The immediate aftermath of the execution saw Virginia authorities attempting to suppress discussion of Louisa's case and Sterling's crimes through various means, including censorship of newspapers that provided too much detail about the sexual abuse testimony, intimidation of enslaved people who tried to discuss the case publicly, and pressure on Methodist Church leaders to conclude their investigation quickly without exposing additional evidence of clergy misconduct. But these suppression efforts proved largely ineffective, given the scale of public interest and the way that Louisa's story resonated with both enslaved people who had experienced similar abuse and Northern abolitionists who used it as evidence that slavery was fundamentally incompatible with Christian civilization. The Methodist Church's response to the scandal involved a combination of defensive denial and limited reforms designed to prevent future cases while avoiding acknowledgement of systemic problems that would have required fundamental changes to how churches operated in slave societies. The reforms included requiring ministers to avoid private meetings with enslaved women, establishing procedures for investigating complaints about clergy misconduct, and removing several ministers who had been credibly accused of sexual abuse. But the reforms stopped short of acknowledging that the problem was inherent in a system that gave white ministers absolute authority over enslaved people, while teaching that resistance to that authority was sin, and church leaders continued to defend slavery as an institution compatible with Christianity, even while acknowledging that individual slaveholders and ministers sometimes behaved badly. The cultural legacy of Louisa's case extended far beyond the immediate scandal, to influence how Americans understood the relationship between religion and slavery, between sexual violence and systems of racial oppression, and between individual acts of resistance and broader social change. For enslaved communities throughout Virginia and beyond, Louisa became a legendary figure who had proven that seemingly powerless people could deliver justice against their oppressors when all other options failed, and her drowning of Sterling in baptismal water became symbolic of how tools of oppression, including religious teachings and church authority, could be turned against oppressors themselves. The Civil War, which began less than 8 years after Louisa's execution, was interpreted by many formerly enslaved people as the ultimate vindication of her resistance and proof that the religious institutions that had sanctioned slavery would eventually face divine judgment for their crimes. The parallel between Louisa drowning one minister who abused his authority and God destroying an entire social system built on systematic violence seemed to confirm the theological framework she had articulated from the gallows, that earthly justice sometimes required human agents to act when established systems failed, and that divine justice would eventually destroy institutions that claimed Christian authority while committing un-Christian crimes. Modern historians studying the Louisa Washington case have documented extensive evidence from trial transcripts, church records, newspaper accounts, and oral histories passed down through generations of Virginia's black community. The case has become a touchstone for discussions about clergy sexual abuse, the ways that religious authority can be weaponized to facilitate exploitation, the limitations of patient endurance as response to systematic violence, and the moral complexity of violence deployed against oppressors who operate within systems that protect them from legal accountability. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a contemporary professor of religious history at the University of Virginia, has written extensively about Louisa's case and its significance for understanding how Christianity functioned in slave societies. Louisa Washington's drowning of Reverend Sterling forces us to grapple with how religious institutions not only failed to prevent sexual abuse of enslaved women, but actively enabled it through theological frameworks that taught submission as Christian duty. Dr. Mitchell argues in her book, Sacred Violence, Religion and Resistance in the Antebellum South. Her case demonstrates that clergy sexual abuse was not anomalous, but systemic in churches that operated within slavery, and that the only justice available to victims was sometimes the justice they delivered themselves through violence that their faith had taught them to avoid. The theological sophistication of Louisa's justification for murder, her argument that Sterling was a false prophet, whose death was execution rather than crime, demonstrates that enslaved Christians developed complex moral frameworks that distinguished between genuine faith and its corruption by white supremacy. The site of Riverside Chapel, where Sterling was drowned, became a memorial maintained by Virginia's black community, who erected a marker in the 1920s that reads, "Here Louisa Washington delivered justice that earthly law refused to provide, proving that baptismal water can cleanse not only through spiritual rebirth, but also through drowning false prophets who corrupt God's church." May her sacrifice remind us that religious authority requires accountability, that clergy who abuse their positions deserve the judgment she delivered, and that submission has limits when it enables evil, rather than serving righteousness. The devastating story of Louisa's 30-year journey from devout child to rape victim to executioner challenges every comfortable narrative about Christianity, slavery, and the moral limits of nonviolent resistance. If this tale of religious abuse, systematic exploitation, and ultimate justice delivered through drowning in holy water has made you think differently about how faith can be both tool of oppression and foundation for violent liberation, let me know in the comments below. Share this video with others who appreciate complex stories